My name is Howard Hayden. I am a retired professor of physics from the University of Connecticut. I have an interest in energy that actually goes back to my college days. I wrote my first paper about energy back in about 1981 or so. And I gave a talk here about, let's call it the follies of renewable energy. No.
Nope, there's nothing.
No, there's
just straight out oil and gas.
Straight out oil, gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, a certain amount of biomass, but that's not really extendable very much because they're not very productive. They only produce at best something like a watt per square meter, thermal watt per square meter of land on year-round average. And that actually is more or less the same as you get out of wind turbines. Wind turbine power goes up, it's proportional to the square of the diameter. But so if you double the diameter, you get 4 times as much power, but you have to put your turbines then twice as far away in both directions, and that means that the power per unit land area is independent of the size of the turbine. And all of the wind farms around the world, and I've got lists of probably 50 of them or something like that, they all average somewhere around 5 kilowatts an acre, or 12.5 kilowatts per hectare. So it's not all impressive.
What's going to be the cost when those continue to fail, as they seem to have failed in Holland, for example?
Well, let me put it this way. The main problem with the failure of the wind turbines is the gearing, because they need to scale up something like 15 RPM to hundreds of RPM, and that speed up in the RPM is very bad on gearboxes, and sometimes they fail. On the other hand, you can develop a kind of a wind turbine that has a larger diameter, but it has a whole bunch of permanent magnets, say using the rare earth elements, so that they can go at normal, 15 RPM speed and generate electricity. So I regard that as an engineering problem to be overcome, and it'll probably be overcome when they do that. The bigger problem is the low power density available for wind farms. There's just nothing you can do about it. And then the other one is the highly variable power with wind speed. Primarily, you make a 10% change in the wind speed, you make a 30% change in the power. Or alternatively, if say the wind speed goes from 10 miles an hour to 20, the power goes up by a factor of 8. Or if it goes from 20 down to 10, the power goes down by a factor of 8. So the grid simply cannot take the high, the rapid fluctuation in the power. And if you want to have steady power, you can't have wind turbines. I mean, at least in numerous wind turbines.
Okay. But there's a notion of storing up energy from these to make them more viable in terms of steam and so forth. Is that a factor?
Well, if you could store the energy, that would be absolutely wonderful, but you could also store energy from your baseload power supplies, which are nukes and coal and so forth, and that way you would be providing cheaper electricity, for the peak time, rather than have to buy it off the peak units. So that technology, yes, it would work for the variable sources like solar and wind, but it also worked for the steady state power. It worked very nicely and cheaper. Let me explain something from Al Gore's movie, which you probably remember. I mean, you probably saw that. Al Gore showed the temperature going up and down over the last 700,000 or 800,000 years. The temperature and CO2 are going up and down more or less together. The question that he did not ask nor answer was, why did the CO2 go down? If reducing CO2 caused the temperature to go down, why did it go down? Where did it go? When the CO2 came up and the temperature came up, where did the CO2 come from and why? And in fact, if you look closely at the data, which he did not do, for every case where they have the ability, the temporal ability to look, detail at the time axis, the temperature changes always occurred before the CO2 changes. And unless you're into retroactive causality, it just doesn't make any sense. Yes, there is a greenhouse effect due to CO2. It's very small. It's not big.
And so does it especially concern you that the population, the younger people, right on down to grade school, kindergarten, and so forth, are being told this basically lie about how climate works?
Yes, it bothers me very much. Schools should not be propaganda machines, and the EPA and such people, powered by their bosses, are turning the education into a propaganda machine, and I find it appalling.
One of the proposals to mitigate the supposed global warming has been put forth by David Keith at Harvard, and he talks about geoengineering as a mechanism to lower, increase the albedo of the sun by reflecting the sun off the clouds. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that proposal that he's made?
Well, a couple of things about it. One of them is there's probably a better way to do it than that, and that would be to fertilize the oceans, because you see, when CO2 goes into the ocean and the plankton take the CO2 out of the ocean and become plant life, but they really lack other nutrition. You put iron in the ocean and all of a sudden you increase the rate at which the plankton absorb the CO2. I think that would be a lot cheaper. Secondly, the long-term effect, the long-term thing that's going on is that the Earth is cooling. It has been cooling because of what's called the Milankovitch cycles. They're getting less and less, just by gradual amounts, of sunlight above 65 degrees north. And you take a look at the glaciers that we have. They're getting less and less, just by gradual amounts of sunlight above 65 degrees north. And you take a look at the glaciers that we have. Do you know that we don't have any glaciers up here in the northern hemisphere that are older than about 8,000 years? All those glaciers are not something left over from the past ice age. They're new. They have been forming as the Earth has been cooling down. And the Milankovitch cycles tell us that eventually the Earth is going to go into this deep freeze again, which has spent 90% of the time in deep freeze over the last several 100,000 years. It spent 90% of its time there in these deep freezes, and we're headed for one. And if CO2 can help stave us off from that a little bit, that would be nice. On a short-term basis, the Earth might warm up, it might cool down and so forth, but the long-term thing over several thousand years, and we don't know when it's going to happen exactly, but the Earth will cool down. And CO2 in the past has not been able to stave that off. And in fact, during what's called the snowball Earth, which was something like 480 million years ago, give or take, I can't remember exactly what the number was, the CO2 level at that time was something like, well, depending on the measurements, 8, 10 times, 20 times what we have now. And that amount of CO2 did not prevent the Earth from going into a snowball configuration. And by snowball, I mean glaciers at sea level at the equator. You know, that's snowball. And the CO2 it didn't stave that off at all. The most important thing for them to understand is that the science of climate is very, very, very complicated, and that it is not settled. And to use a, let's see, a meme of, slips my mind right now. The gentleman is Canadian. He says that, okay, it's Tim Ball. You remember his name, Tim Ball. He says that climate is a generalist subject. In other words, we have information that we get from artists who are painting things like the frozen Thames. We have information from records of crop failures and good crops, good years, and so forth. We have geology. We have stories, you know, novels and all that sort of stuff. We have chemistry. We have some physics. We have paleontology. Biology tells us about past CO2 and so forth. And it is the height of arrogance to think that a few guys writing computer programs about nothing more than just kind of the way they conceive of the present and the way the atmosphere presently is. It's a height of arrogance to believe that they understand climate. They do not. My idea is just to try and get the science as straight as I can, and the devil take the hindmost.